Well, last time, you perhaps will recall, we started our discussion about whether or not animals have hope. And in so doing, we looked at a series of fairly grisly experiments upon animals in the quest to uncover whether or not animals can be said to have hope. Now, today we're going to turn to another view of whether or not animals have hope, but our focus will not be the explication of scientific studies. We will not be talking about the testing of hypotheses. We will not be talking about controlled studies. We will be guilty of this thing that we discussed previously called anthropomorphism, the projection of human characteristics and values onto non-human actors. And so one might ask, why would we do that? Because this is, after all, a science course. And yet, it is a legitimate question for this course because we're looking at this in an evolutionary perspective. And if hope is indeed instilled in us as a course, as a product of our genes, then we would expect for evolution to have begun elsewhere in the animal kingdom with this installation of hope in our genes. So we might be able to find vestiges of hope in animals, and that would, of course, have implications for how we view animals as humans. So we're going to hear a series of anecdotal stories that make this case. We'll start in part one with a number of recitations from the scientist Loren Eiseley, so we will be getting some science in this section. And then we're going to conclude with a local story that I'm entitling The Voices of the Lambs. Now, we might begin with a definition of the word anecdotal, in case you're not familiar with it. I've taken this definition from the Free Dictionary published by Farlex, where they describe anecdotal as, quote, not necessarily true or reliable because it is based on personal accounts rather than facts or research. So I think I basically explained that in my introduction to today's presentation. We're not talking about the testing of hypotheses. We're talking about stories that are reported by humans and which may or may not have a factual basis. But the point is, we humans derive a certain kind of comfort and perhaps even edification from these reports, and so they're worth our time to listen to them, even if we cannot verify them explicitly using the tools of science. I mentioned that we're going to start with some discussion from one of my favorite scientists, Loren Eiseley. He will, in fact, be giving us 3 offerings in this section. He is a very renowned anthropologist who spent most of his career at the University of Pennsylvania. And he is the author of many books, some of them about his specialty in anthropology, but the bulk of them became popular books, that is to say, read by non-scientists and scientists alike. And these books were about human behavior and about naturalism. And typically they were written in sort of an out-of-door essay style. So they became quite popular during the 60s and 70s, and he became a very well-known person as a result of the publication of these many books. We're going to use one of those essays entitled The Judgment of the Birds as a mechanism for looking at the question of whether we find hope in birds. In this particular essay, which is rather lengthy, and at this point in the course you may have already seen it in the exploratory exercises, and if so, I'll just refresh your memory. The essay has it's subdivided into a series of 4 vignettes, and we're going to skip the first 2 and go straight to the third, in which Eiseley is walking around as an anthropologist in some back country, well away from the beaten path. He's renowned for going into very remote parts of the world, often only accessible by mule or some other primitive form of transportation. He would go back there for many days, if not weeks at a time, to do his anthropological work. So this is one such occasion. He's in the backcountry, and he's been walking for the better part of the day, and he comes to a clearing in the woods, a glade, he calls it, and he sits down to rest for a bit, and this is where he witnesses the events that are encapsulated in the title, Judgment of the Birds. The specific event that precipitates this is that he witnesses the murder of a nestling bird by a raven, which is a predator. So at this point, let's simply defer to Mr. Isley, Dr. Isley, and listen to an excerpt from the Judgment of the Birds. He says, quote, "I have said that I saw a judgment upon life, and that it was not passed by men. Those who stare at birds in cages, or who test minds by their closeness to our own, may not care for it. It comes from a faraway place out of my past, in a place of pouring waters and green leaves. I shall never see an episode like it again if I live to be 100, nor do I think that one man in a million has ever seen it, because man is an intruder into such silences. The light must be right, and the observer must remain unseen. No man sets up such an experiment. What he sees by chance. You may put it that I had come over a mountain, that I had slogged through fern and pine needles for half a day long, and that on the edge of a little glade with one long crooked branch extending across it, I had sat down to rest with my back against a stump. Through accident, I was concealed from the glade, although I could see into it perfectly. The sun was warm there, and the murmurs of forest life blurred softly away into my sleep. When I awoke, dimly aware of some commotion and outcry in the clearing, the light was slanting down through the pines in such a way that the glade was lit like some vast cathedral. I could see the dust motes of wood pollen in the long shaft of life, and there, extended on a branch, sat an enormous raven with a red and squirming nestling in his beak. The sound that awoke me was the outraged cries of the nestling's parents, who flew helplessly in circles about the clearing. The sleek black monster was indifferent to them. He gulped, wetted his beak on the dead branch a moment, and sat still. Up to that point, the little tragedy had followed the usual pattern. But suddenly, out of all that area of woodland, a soft sound of complaint began to rise. Into the glade fluttered small birds of half a dozen varieties, drawn by the anguished outcries of the tiny parents. No one dared to attack the raven, but they cried there in some instinctive common misery, the bereaved and the unbereaved. The glade filled with their soft rustling and their cries. They fluttered as though to point their wings at the murderer. There was a dim, intangible ethic he had violated that they knew. He was a bird of death, and he, the murderer, the black bird at the heart of life, sat on there, glistening in the common light, formidable, unmoving, unperturbed, untouchable. The sign died. It was then that I saw the judgment. It was the judgment of life against death. I will never see it again, so forcefully presented. I will never hear it again, in notes so tragically prolonged. For in the midst of protest, they forgot the violence. There in that clearing, the crystal note of the song sparrow lifted hesitantly in the hush. And finally, after painful fluttering, another took the song, and then another, the song passing from one bird to another, doubtfully at first, as though some evil thing were slowly being forgotten. Till suddenly they all took heart and sang from many throats, joyously together as birds are known to sing. They sang because life is sweet and sunlight beautiful. They sang under the brooding shadow of the raven. In simple truth, they had forgotten the raven, for they were singers of life and not of death. Hope in birds. Did those birds mourn? We certainly got a suggestion that that's possible from the paper we talked about last time with the jays. Maybe it's possible that the capacity to mourn, if indeed that's what's happening, is something that can be shared by birds that are not in the same species. Maybe conspecifics can join in some sort of ritualistic observation of hope. Is that what was going on in the glade where Isley sat that day? Well, it's tempting to make that case, but Isley himself could not let it go at that. He could not let even his beautiful prose stand unanalyzed. So later in the essay, he said, quote, "The mind which was my human endowment was sure to question it," meaning the judgment, "and to be at me day by day with its heresies," by which he means, parenthetically, anthropomorphism, "until I grew to doubt the meaning of what I had seen." Ever the scientist, he has to pull his punches even when he's writing at his finest. Now, in the same essay, there's another animal-based vignette. And in this particular story, Isley finds hope, and of all things, since most of us are creeped out by spiders, Isley finds hope in a spider. And he does so in late fall, I think in November, when almost everything in his home environment, he lived in Pennsylvania, so it's a temperate climate by that time of the year, everything living has gone underground or has died as a result of the persistent cold. And what he sees that day, that night, is that there's a very large spider, female spider, trying to use the globe of a street lamp to keep warm while she tries to spin her web, even as winter sets in and her life cycle becomes finished. So let's listen to what he had to say about that spider. Again, from the essay, Judgment of the Birds, quote, "And so it proved until, on top of a stepladder, I made one more observation about life. It was cold that autumn evening, and standing under a suburban street lamp in a spate of leaves and beginning snow, I was suddenly conscious of some huge and hairy shadows dancing over the pavement. They seemed attached to an odd globular shape that was magnified above me. There was no mistaking it. I was standing under the shadow of an orb-weaving spider. Gigantically projected against the street, she was about her spinning when everything else was going underground. Even her cables were magnified on the sidewalk, and I already was half entangled in their shadows. Good Lord, I thought. She has found herself a kind of minor sun and is going to upset the course of nature. I procured a ladder from my yard and climbed up to inspect the situation. There she was, the universe running down around her, warmly arranged among her guy ropes attached to the lamp supports. a great black and yellow embodiment of the life force, not giving up to either frost or stepladders. She ignored me and went on about tightening and improving her web. I stood over her a moment longer, comprehending somewhat reluctantly that her adventure against the great blind forces of winter, her seizure of this warming globe of light, would come to nothing, and it was hopeless. Nevertheless, it brought the birds back to my mind, and that faraway song which had traveled with growing strength around a forest clearing years ago. A kind of heroism, a world where even a spider refuses to lie down and die if a rope can be spun onto a star. Maybe man himself will fight like this in the end, I thought, slowly realizing that the web and its threatening yellow occupant had been added to some luminous store of experience, shining for a moment in the fog-bound reaches of my brain. The mind, it came to me, as I slowly descended the ladder, is a very remarkable thing. It has gotten itself a kind of courage by looking at a spider in a street lamp. Here was something that ought to be passed on to those who will fight our final freezing battle with the void. I thought of setting it down carefully as a message to the future. In the days of frost, seek a minor sun. But as I hesitated, it became plain that something was wrong. The marvel was escaping, a sense of bigness beyond man's power to grasp, the essence of life in its great dealings with the universe. It was better, I decided, for the emissaries returning from the wilderness, even if they were merely descending from a stepladder, to record their marvel, not to define its meaning. In that way, it would go about echoing on through the minds of men, each grasping at that beyond, out of which miracles emerge, and which, once defined, ceases to satisfy the human need for symbols. In the end, I merely made a mental note. One species of Epeira observed building a web in a street lamp. And so, his poetry falls once again to the fear of anthropomorphism. But in its wake, he produced an essay which lives on not only in his heart, but in the minds and hearts of those who read it. So this is the lesson, that there's a kind of heroism in that spider, an example that we humans might consider emulating when we are pushed to the brink, up against that wall from which there is no return. In the days of frost, whatever the source of that frost might be, seek a minor sun. If so lowly a beast as a spider can find it, surely we humans can as well. And now one final offering from Isley, which is not part of the essay, Judgment of the Bird. This is another very famous essay by Lauren Isley, entitled The Star Thrower. It's the sort of thing that has caught on as a tale worthy of retelling and has been co-opted by, among others, preachers and motivational speakers because of its message, which is, you don't have to save the entire world, just your little part of it. So let me reiterate to you the essentials of The Star Thrower, because I'm hoping you'll find this yet another revelation of the kind of hope that animals can inspire in humans. So, in this particular vignette, what is happening is that Isley, who in all probability was clinically depressed through most of his adult life and is probably the poster child for SSRIs, he was in one of his funks. He was completely demoralized, he decided to escape the United States. He traveled to Spain, to a place called Costabel, basically to get away from himself. He was in a very bad state. And he was taking walks on the beach at the place he was staying. And one day when he was doing this, he saw a lone figure at the other end of the beach who was repeatedly bending down, picking something up from the sand, and then casting it far off into the water. And this piqued Isaac's curiosity. And so he strolled closer and closer to whatever this man was and whatever he was doing. And eventually, when he got close enough, he realized that what the man was doing was, one by one, picking up starfish that had been stranded on the beach by the tide and returning them to the sea that they might live. Often the stranded starfish would perish from the lack of water if the tide didn't come back in quickly enough. Plus, when the tide goes out and the sea fish are just laying there on the beach, they're easy pickings for predators. So Isley walks up to this guy and he says, "You know what? You are a real fool. There are so many starfish out there. What you're doing is just ridiculous. You cannot make a difference. Most of these starfish are going to die." And the star thrower paused for a moment to consider what Isley had said, and then he, in defiance, picked up another starfish and threw it back into the ocean that it might live. And he proclaimed, "Well, it makes a difference to this one." And that rattled Isley a little bit, but it didn't cause any real change in perspective. So he walks back to his hotel room and broods for a while longer. And then that evening, when everything was quiet and he had the ability to think to himself and to ponder the events of the day, he had an epiphany. He understood that it was a miraculous thing for a man to reach out a hand in pity across the gulf of evolution that separated man from starfish, and for no particular payoff to spend the time and effort to take that starfish and to throw it back to the mother sea. And he also understood in that moment, in that epiphany, that it wasn't so much the starfish the man had sought to save, but men as well, because mankind seems to be perennially in need of redemption. And that realization sanctified Isley. He came back to life. And after that, Isley, too, joined the star thrower, and every morning could be found casting starfish back to the sea alongside the original star thrower. And now we come to the second part. This is not a Lauren Isley story. This is a tale that was told to me by a neighbor. We lived across the street from each other in Delaware, Ohio. And she had been born on a farm in Marion County, Ohio. And they had a number of animals, of which the sheep were her favorite. And every spring they would have a crop of lambs, and it was her job to take care of the orphan lambs. So any given year they might have 100 babies, and she would be out there before breakfast helping to herd the lambs in, make sure everybody got fed, and tend to any orphan lambs that might be found. So it was kind of an idyllic life. Not only did they have sheep, they grew crops, they had horses. It's the kind of childhood that most of us dream about because you're out in the country, you're running around outside all day. It just seems like a wonderful place to be. And this particular event took place in late spring in that farm in Marion County, Ohio, roughly 40 years ago. So my friend, whose name is Diane, was outside tending the lambs, and then all of a sudden the wind kicked up and the sky grew very dark. Her mother had been out taking the laundry down, and when she saw this change in the weather take place, she immediately summoned Diane and her siblings in and ordered them down into the root cellar right away. And this kind of scared Diane. She said, why are we doing this? And her mother said, there's a tornado coming. And as she said that, they heard this enormous crash. And they looked over to the barn and saw that the horses had broken down the gate that kept them in the barn and were now galloping across the pasture. And Diane said, well, why did they do that? And her mother explained that horses understand. They have kind of a sixth sense about weather, and they know when dangerous weather, like a tornado, is coming. And they also have this intuitive understanding that they're better off outside the barn in a large storm like a tornado. And so they broke out of the barn so that they could flee to the pasture and take their chances out there where something was less likely to fall on them and crush them. So this was meant to comfort Diane, but she realized that the sheep, her lambs, her precious lambs, were still in the barn. And she looked at her mother wide-eyed and said, but what's going to happen to them? Don't they have that voice, that sixth sense inside them? And her mother just shook her head and said, no, they just don't. And we'll just have to hope that the barn makes it through. So they all went down into the root cellar, and the wind started howling, and they could hear things crashing around as the tornado hit, and things that normally are stationary started blowing around. And this went on for a good long time, but eventually, an hour or so later, all of the noise stopped, and so the family emerged from the root cellar and went out to inspect the damage. And this is what they found. Lots of things had happened. Several trees were uprooted. The porch had blown off the main house, but more tragically, the barn had completely collapsed. And they just stood and stared at it for a while. There was nothing they could do to make it better. They were processing what had happened. They were not coming away with any clarity. But eventually they walked over to the barn to inspect it, and Diane was in tears at this point because it was clear that nothing could have survived the fall of that barn. So they walked around and surveyed the damage, and were almost ready to go back to the house when they heard the faint bleating of what sounded like a lamb. So they went over, they heard it again. They started pulling off boards in the part of the pile that the sound was coming from. And after a little while, they pulled a lamb out. It was alive. Wow, that was amazing. But they heard more bleating from that pile. And so that spurred them to action. They pulled off more boards. And as they did that, more and more lambs, more and more of the babies emerged, unscathed, alive, and untouched by the calamity that took place in the barn. So they were now really spurred to industry. They were just going at it like crazy, pulling those boards off. And after a couple hours, they had extracted almost every one of those 100 lambs alive and well. But what could explain that? And more particularly, why weren't any of the ewes, the parents, why did they not recover any living sheep? So this was a profound mystery. It didn't make any sense. And now they had almost 100 baby lambs who needed to be fed. So they summoned the neighbors. They all came over, and they used a tractor and some heavy equipment to pull apart the remains of the barn. And after they got done with that excavation, they saw the most amazing sight that anyone has ever seen. What they saw when they stripped away all the boards was that all of the ewes, all of the mother sheep, were lined up shoulder to shoulder. Now think about that. If you know anything about sheep, you know that they have to be herded. They have to be herded, for instance, by a herd dog who will get them all to move as a group in one direction. But you cannot make a whole bunch of lambs or a whole bunch of sheep stand shoulder to shoulder in a perfectly straight line. That's just unsheep-like. It isn't done. And even with a good herd dog, you can't make them stand still in a straight line. And so what had happened is that in this configuration, standing shoulder to shoulder in a perfectly straight line, these sheep, the mother sheep, broke the fall of the main beam of the barn with their own bodies. In the process, they were crushed. But their sacrifice had created just enough space for the baby lambs to survive. Now, what does this mean? Do lambs have an inner voice that tells them what to do in times of trial? We don't know. But it's a curious event that ought to make us think. And this is the reason why I give you this story now. It's such an unusual thing and so provocative in its effect that it's worthy of your consideration. Do animals have hope? Do they have a sixth sense? I don't know. I'll leave it to you to decide. And here's your study guide for this module.